All right, third edition of vehicle systems, how they work and work together, so that way you have a better understanding to build your car properly, because you don't. Um, Today's video is going to be about fuel systems. It is a rather large subject to talk about because there's lots of things and lots of moving parts, if you will, that go into the fuel system and different ways to do it, if that makes sense, um, to accomplish your goal. And I should say and preface that most people don't do it correctly, because it does get expensive. And unfortunately, if you want to do it correctly, you have to spend the money on it. And I know that's a tough thing to spend money on that doesn't technically add any power. But what it is there to do is support the power you're trying to make. So it is what it is. It's like going into a battle without armor, you know. So, anyways, fuel system. We'll kind of start off with like how a stock car works, and then we can kind of graduate as we go with modifications. But a stock fuel system is going to have a fuel pump in the tank, and either the fuel pump hat has a regulator in it, or if it's a saddle tank, there's going to be like a surge pump or a transfer pump. Oftentimes in that surge pump or transfer pump, there's a regulator in that, and that regulator regulates the fuel pressure to 58 psi. So that fuel pump with 14 volts, 14 volts as long as your alternator is working properly, would more than likely flow more than 58 pounds of fuel pressure if it was not regulated. It is regulated. Okay. So when your vehicle is operating, your PCM knows that we're at 58 psi. Your injector sizing is based on 58 psi of fuel pressure. So if like we have 50 pound an hour injectors at 58 psi, the computer knows this. So then in turn, when we have the airflow model and airflow coming in, we talked about yesterday in yesterday's video, airflow model video, that now the computer can see how much airflow is coming in. It knows based on, we have the size injectors, we have fuel pressure. That's how much time the injector needs to be turned on in order to achieve stoich, right? So our computer, like we talked about in the first video, is trying to achieve stoich, okay? We're not going to get into stoich of different fuels or anything like that. We're just going to focus on the gasoline scale. Any different fuel, gasoline, diesel, ethanol, E85, whatever, they all are a scale of lambda, okay? Lambda of 1 is what the computer's actually targeting, and lambda of 1 is stoich for all fuels, okay? But while it's simpler, it's a process to kind of understand, right? So most people understand gasoline scale, and that's just what we're going to talk in. The computer is going to target 14.7 to 1 for idle part throttle, and that means that our fuel trims, our oxygen sensors, are going to come in on the backside and tell us that airflow that you told us that's coming in here, based on also the injector size and the fuel that we injected, that outcome after the combustion process is 5% off, is 20% off, whatever. We use those fuel trims to correct, right? Either the airflow model, most of the time the airflow model. But the reason why I say most of the time is because there are things that we can do as a tuner, because most of the time people's fuel systems are not up to par for what they're trying to do. And we as tuners have to band-aid that somehow, okay? We have to tune incorrectly to get the outcome to be what we want it. All right. So this is why I said in the end of the last video, all these people that post pictures of people's tunes, whether it's their airflow model or whatever, you have no idea what that person tuning was dealing with. If they're dealing with dropping fuel pressure, guess what? That's just the way it is. Like that, in order for me to have the outcome of the actual of what I want it to be, I have to manipulate something because your lack of something somewhere, right? So we're going to talk about lack of fuel pressure, which is pretty common. Okay, so when we have a supercharged setup, a turbocharged setup, whatever, uh, we are demanding more from the engine. The engine is demanding more fuel because we have more air coming in, right? Well, that pump is going to flow as much as it possibly can flow. And then once it gets to a point where the fuel pump is just like, hey, that's all I can do. Well, then we have a situation of it's not going to be able to keep up with the demand at the fuel rail, and our fuel rail is going to start dropping fuel pressure. So when that happens, what can we change? Okay. As a tuner, we can manipulate the airflow model. Okay. So is it right? No. Is it going to be bad? Probably not, in the sense of if we raise the airflow model, we're telling it that it's making more airflow than it actually is to achieve a richer air fuel mixture. When we raise the air fuel model, just like the airflow model, just like we talked about in the last video, then in turn we will get higher shift pressures because we're telling it it's making more airflow, right? So it's saying we're making more torque than we actually are, and we will get better shift pressures. Now the downside, the caveat to that is that at part throttle, under a specific decent load under part throttle, we could get overly harsh shifting because we have had to manipulate that airflow model in order to achieve what we want to get, right? Is that the right thing? Technically, no, right? The right thing to do would technically be telling the computer that your injector size is getting smaller, because they are, right? Injector size is sized based on fuel pressure. So if we have 58 pounds of fuel pressure, they're rated at 50 pounds an hour. Well, if we have less fuel pressure, are they 50 pounds an hour? No, they're smaller than that, right? They flow less. So usually that's what we got to combat, and we can take care of it in the airflow model. But technically, the right way to do it is to tell it it's getting a smaller injector, because technically they are getting smaller, right? That's not as easy to do in tuning as just raising the airflow model, because usually the data, you just want to set it and forget it. It's like it's derived data for that injector. But also, if you have fuel pressure dropping, that's technically wrong, right? So that being said, there's another addition to that when we're talking a boosted car. Now we have, let's say, 10 psi of boost. We have dropping fuel pressure. Let's say the fuel pressure is dropping 10 pounds. We're just going to use tens as numbers that are easy to do in head, right? So let's say we start out at 58 psi during the pull. Well, this is wide open throttle. And by the end of the pull, our fuel pressure drops to 48 psi, because the pump is just, hey, we're on and we're flowing as much as we possibly can. At the end of the pull, it just drops to 48 psi. Not the end of the world, right? Not great, but not the end of the world. But the other thing that we have to think about is that the injector is in a port, right? And that port has pressure now, right? It's boosted. So that pressure is fighting against that injector. So 10 psi fighting against the injector as far as it opening and pressing, or, doing the fuel. What's the term that I would say? Injecting the fuel, right? So now it's got to combat that, right? So that's what we call pressure delta. Now we have pressure delta of 10 psi, and then we have fuel pressure drop of 10 psi. Those injectors are technically sized with the thought process of they're operating at 38 psi, right? Because we had the 48 psi up top, and now we have 10 psi fighting against it, so we take 10 away from that. That's how we kind of like get the pressure delta figured out, is now we're operating at 38 psi. So those 50 pound an hour injectors at 58 psi are now operating at 38 psi. What size are those injectors? That's a good question. I don't really know. We just kind of have to guess, right? So that's the problem, is that we have to battle that and band-aid that in the tune file because of the build that you've created, right? Now, there's ways to combat that mechanically, okay? And this is where we start getting into fuel systems. So, asterisk, no, a larger set of injectors is not going to help, okay? If there is no fuel pressure behind a 1300cc injector, guess what? It's not a 1300cc injector, okay? So overly going super large on injectors is not going to be the fix for lack of fuel pressure. Got it? Lack of fuel pressure needs to be fixed with fuel pressure, okay? Then we won't have to oversize our injectors so much because they'll be sized properly. Okay. There's other, and we'll get into an injector video on why oversizing your injectors isn't good, but we're not going to talk about that right now. So, fuel pressure. We want to maintain 58 psi. How do we do that? Okay, we can put a dual pump in our setup. If we put a dual pump in our setup, now we have flow. Okay, now we have flow that possibly can keep up with our 10 psi of boost, right? Whatever power we're making at 10 psi, now we have enough flow to keep up with that. So now let's say we maintain 58 psi, but we still have that pressure delta that we got to fight against, right? So we're operating at 48 psi, technically. Okay, well, that's all fine and dandy up to about 10 psi, right? So we can still band-aid that. We can still use that. That's not like a huge problem, if you will, to band-aid 10 psi of pressure delta, as long as that fuel pressure isn't just like taking a hike, right? Okay. Once we get past 10 psi, that's when things start getting a little messy, because then our pressure delta starts going up, right? And our theoretical fuel pressure starts dropping, and we don't want that, right? So that's going to cause us to go, oh, we need larger injectors. We don't. We just need fuel pressure, right? All right. So in order to combat the over 10 psi, let's say 15, 20 psi pressure delta, we need to have what we do is called a return style fuel system, and that takes the regulator out of the tank, brings it somewhere like in the engine bay, and that regulator, that aftermarket regulator, has a port on it, okay, that can get a vacuum source or a boost source, right? The same thing, it would just come from the manifold. And the idea behind that is very much like a turbocharger's wastegate. You know, you add pressure on top of the wastegate to get more boost because it's basically making the spring stronger. We're going to add pressure on top of the diaphragm in that pressure regulator, fuel pressure regulator, to increase our fuel pressure over our base. So we have a base pressure of 58 psi. When we add the 15 psi of boost, on top of that diaphragm through the regulator, well, now that should raise our fuel pressure up by another 15 psi. Okay, so now when we have 15 psi of pressure against that injector, we've raised the fuel pressure on top of the injector. So we kind of got rid of that delta, right? They equal each other out. We're in equilibrium, if you will. And now the injector's operating at what we would figure is 58 psi. It's not an exact science. Everything's done mechanically here. So like you may only add 10 psi on top of that diaphragm, or you may add 15, but you may only get 10 psi of fuel pressure, or sometimes you add 10 psi on top of that diaphragm and you might get 20 psi of fuel pressure. It's not like an exact science, but the idea is we're increasing fuel pressure to combat the pressure delta, right? Does that make sense? All right, so that's the perfect scenario. Now, if you have that type of setup, you need to have a fire extinguisher in your car, right? The reason why we would have that in a fire extinguisher in our car is because those lines are now handmade by a human, right? And anything can go wrong, right? And now you have fittings that are, if they loosen up and they start spraying fuel against the header or something like that, because this is all in the engine bay now. This is all things that need to be taken into account. So you need to have a fire extinguisher in the car. All right. Now, what is, what does a Hellcat do? What does a ZL1 do? All right, so those from the factory, we'll just use a Hellcat for example. I feel like they do it the best over GM, but the Hellcat is not a return style fuel system, but it has a single pump, and then like the Red Eye, the Trackhawk, TRX, Durant, whatever. Anything above just a base Hellcat has 2 pumps, okay? So we'll just start with a single pump Hellcat first, and the single pump Hellcat is a pulse width modulated fuel pump, okay? So don't put a Hellcat fuel pump in your Scat Pack, your 5.7 or whatever, or don't put a Hellcat fuel pump in any vehicle that doesn't have a fuel pump control module. Why, do you ask? Well, the fuel pump control module gets your voltage, your 14 volts from your alternator in the rest of your car, and then it regulates that voltage to the fuel pump to maintain a fuel pressure of 58 psi. Okay, so if you do not have the fuel pump control module, you're just shoving 14 volts to that fuel pump. That fuel pump is now on 100% of the time. So very similar to like a pulse width modulated fan, you never want to command a pulse width modulated fan 100% and let it run all the time because you're going to burn it up. The fuel pump is actually in a liquid and it's not really going to burn it up, but it's heating up the fuel pump. Like it's going to heat up the fuel, and also you're maxing out that pump. So that pump is going to overcome your factory regulator, right? And how much? Who knows? It depends on your factory regulator. If it's, you know, efficient or inefficient, and it's old, or if it's brand new, like there's no telling. You may have like 80 psi of fuel pressure at idle. And then as you drive it, it starts to drop. Well, that's going to screw everything up, right? Because the whole car is based on 58 psi of fuel pressure, injector size and everything. And now you're just shoving 80 psi to it. That's not good, right? So don't do that. All right, jumping back into the Hellcats. The Hellcat, it modulates that fuel pressure by, you know, applying a lower voltage than 14 volts to the fuel pump, and it maintains 58 psi idle and part throttle. At wide open throttle, when it goes into boost, it will increase that voltage to the pump, and in turn, it raises it to 80 psi of fuel pressure. All right, but the car is also designed that it knows that the fuel pressure is going to go to 80 psi, okay? So when we're at 80 psi, well, that combats that pressure delta, right? So that pressure of 10 or 11 pounds, whatever a factory Hellcat comes with, is combated with an extra whatever psi of fuel pressure from 58 to 22 psi of fuel pressure. And now it combats that pressure delta, and everything's great until you start making 18 psi of boost and 22 psi of boost. Now that fuel pump is going to start fighting a pressure delta again, where you get to a point to where you start running out of fuel pump on a Hellcat again, okay? And then that's where like the dual pumps come in, from like a Red Eye and stuff like that. You can do that, all right? So all that's doing is adding flow. So we can go up to, you know, 18 psi of boost and have a Hellcat with dual pumps and still maintain like the factory fuel pump control modules, because they do go up to 80 psi and sometimes 90 psi of fuel pressure to combat that. And that's all to combat pressure delta. It's also allowing smaller injectors to be in your vehicle for idle and part throttle, because at idle and part throttle, if you have a super large injector, it has a worse spray pattern. Again, I got into it a little bit. We're going to save that for another video. So now they can have a smaller injector in the car and then shove 90 psi to that injector. Well, 90 psi behind a, let's say, a 58 pound an hour injector turns it into a larger injector for sure, right? There's more flow with 90 psi than there would at 58 psi, right? Okay, that's how that works. That's how the factory did it. Okay. As far as like a ZL1 and a GM side of things, they typically they do the pulse width modulated as well, but they just try to maintain 58 psi. So they don't raise it above 58 psi. It just kind of hangs out at 58 psi and adds to it in order to try and maintain that 58 psi. But it'll never go to like 80 or nothing like that unless you have some sort of aftermarket pump that allows that, right? So the idea behind this is we want to maintain 58 psi. Okay, nobody does that. So again, in tuning, we have to band-aid that. And there's a certain threshold when that band-aid is not a possibility. Okay, I just got done with I didn't get done with it yet. We were tuning it. A C5 Corvette has a booster pump and a booster pump. All right, so that's trying to add voltage to a stock pump, like add 18 to 20 volts to a stock fuel pump. When you add 18 to 20 volts to a fuel pump, it's going to flow more, but you're going to wear the hell out of that pump, right? Because it's operating at a voltage that it's not supposed to operate at, right? So I added that booster pump situation in there just because that's what I just started talking about the car, but that's the problem. We have a car with a stock fuel pump and a booster pump. We have boost, and what's happening is we're getting our commanded air fuel, and then it just starts taking a hike. All right, when it starts taking a hike like that, that's not something that's a tuning problem, right? There's nothing in the tune that really is going to go, oh, that's a signature of I need to do this to this table. When you start seeing a straight linear line, that means fuel pressure's dropping. All right, and that comes with time. Whenever you're tuning a vehicle and you see that trend, you're gonna know, like, hey, I'm gonna make one change to see if I can combat that. If I cannot combat that and it still does that, well, we got a fuel pressure problem, right? So that's where we stop. And that's exactly what we did. We made a couple pulls, we made one change. Did it fix it? No, it still got that trend. All right, we're dropping fuel pressure. Something's got to get figured out before we move on, because you don't want to finish tune a car with that problem, because you're going to band-aid it in a sense of you'll get your end outcome great at the end, but down here at the lower RPMs, you may be way too rich just to try and combat that. And that's not the way to tune, okay? So I know I kind of got into the tuning side of things a little bit, because that's really a better way for you to understand how that all works, because that's what I had to combat. But I think that's the gist of fuel systems in the sense of how they work. And then tomorrow's video, we'll talk more about fuel injectors, because there's a lot to that as well. We're going to kind of revisit what we talked about with the pressure delta and stuff like that. But there's some things to talk about on fuel injectors that needs to be said. So again, if you're enjoying these things, like, comment, subscribe, do whatever. If you are interested in knowing about something, comment it, let me know, and we'll see you in the next one.